In the shadowed recesses of the royal bedchamber, where ancient tapestries hung like silent witnesses to the ebb and flow of empires, their threads woven with tales of forgotten conquests and heroic deeds long faded into the mists of time, the air itself seemed to thicken with anticipation. The scent of smoldering myrrh wafted through the chamber, a heavy aromatic veil that clung to every surface, mingling with the faint metallic tang of polished armor and the underlying musk of unspoken fears. Flickering candlelight danced across the stone walls, casting elongated shadows that twisted like serpents in the dim glow, as if the very architecture of the palace conspired to heighten the drama of the moment. She, the queen, stood therein in regal poise yet veiled vulnerability, her silken gown pooling around her like a river of midnight, awaiting his final command with a heart that beat in rhythm to the distant drums of impending war. The king, armored in the cold, unyielding gleam of steel plates that hugged his form like a second skin, etched with intricate engravings of mythical beasts and victorious battles, turned to his queen with eyes like tempered blades, sharp, unblinking, forged in the fires of ambition and resolve. His presence dominated the room, a towering figure whose every movement echoed with the weight of authority, his crowned helm resting nearby on a velvet cushion, its jewels catching the light like stars trapped in earthly confines. "You shall not utter my name," he decreed, his voice a low, resonant rumble that reverberated off the cold stone walls, carrying the gravity of ancient oaths and unbreakable traditions. "Nor shall you cross this threshold until the stars align once more for my return. When the celestial bodies decree the hour of reunion." Her lips parted in a silent protest, a fleeting glimpse of the fire that burned within her soul, but the weight of centuries-old tradition sealed them shut with invisible force, transforming her into a specter bound by chains forged not of iron, but of societal expectation and royal decree. For in that pivotal moment, on the eve of war, when the kingdom teetered on the brink of chaos and glory, her world contracted to the fragile confines of waned silence and solitude, a punishment veiled as piety, a ritual that stripped her of agency and voice before the first arrow whistled through the air or the first sword clashed in the fray. Ask yourself, dear listener, as the echoes of this scene linger, in your mind, what secrets does power conceal when it begins not with the thunderous clash of swords on distant battlefields, but with the hushed, intimate edict of a husband's command, whispered in the sanctity of the bedchamber? This was no aberration, no fleeting madness born from the tormented soul of a single ruler lost in the grip of paranoia. Nay, formed the intricate thread in a vast, unyielding tapestry of dominion, one that stretched across the ages like an endless river of control. From the sun-baked ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia, where the first kings erected their mud-brick fortresses under the watchful eyes of the gods, to the fog-shrouded castles of medieval Europe, perched precariously on craggy cliffs amid swirling mists that concealed both beauty and peril, rulers, cloaked in the opulent mantle of divinity, their robes embroidered with symbols of celestial favor and earthly might, enacted these pre-war rituals, not as whimsical indulgences or capricious whims, but as sacred covenants, binding pacts sworn before altars of stone and gold, where the fates of nations hung in the balance. These covenants imposed restrictions upon their consorts that mirrored, in cruel symmetry, the subjugation they sought to impose abroad upon conquered peoples and rival kings. Empires rose like phoenixes from the ashes of their predecessors, only to fall into ruin under the weight of their own excesses. Yet this enduring pattern persisted through the sands of time. The king's profound fear of vulnerability, a gnawing insecurity that projected itself onto the most intimate vessel of his legacy, his wife, the bearer of his heirs and the guardian of his heart. What began as a personal edict, uttered in the quiet intimacy of a royal chamber, swelled inexorably into a sprawling apparatus of control, enforced with meticulous precision by priests in flowing robes who chanted incantations from sacred texts, and by stoic guards clad in chainmail who stood sentinel like statues carved from unyielding granite. This machinery of dominance was justified by the cryptic utterances of omens and oracles, diviners who read the entrails of sacrificed animals or the patterns in the stars, proclaiming that any deviation from these rituals would invite catastrophe upon the realm. And in every grand court, from the opulent halls of ancient Persia, where fountains of rosewater cascaded into marble basins and silk-draped divans invited languid repose, to the austere keeps of medieval England, with their draughty corridors and roaring hearth fires that offered scant comfort against the chill of winter, the Queen's subjugation served as the unseen, silent prologue to the grand symphony of slaughter that would unfold on blood-soaked fields. It was a prelude composed not in notes of music, but in the stifled breaths and downcast eyes of women who bore the invisible scars of power's embrace. Ponder this, listener, in the grand narrative of history. How often does the hero's triumph abroad rely upon the quiet suffering at home, a foundation built on the cracked stones of inequality? Imagine, if you will, the illusion of grandeur that enveloped these realms like a shimmering mirage in a desert of reality. The marble palace is aglow with the warm, golden torchlight that illuminated every corner, where gold chalices overflowed with the finest wines from distant vineyards, their ruby depths reflecting the faces of nobles, innards, their merry revelry, and where incense curled lazily like serpents toward vaulted ceilings, adorned with vibrant frescoes depicting heroic deeds, gods descending to aid mortal warriors, and scenes of eternal victory, etched in pigments that seemed to pulse with life. Kings strode forth as embodiments of divine war, their cloaks billowing like the wings of avenging angels dispatched from the heavens, promising glory to the faithful subjects who knelt in adoration and utter ruin to the foe who dared challenge their supremacy. The courts buzzed with the ceaseless murmur of nobles in their finery, velvet doublets embroidered with threads of silver, jewels that sparkled like captured stars, discussing strategies in hushed tones, the sharp clash of al-Nanalai, armor as squires polished blades and fitted greaves, and the rhythmic chants of priests invoking blessings upon the impending fray, their voices rising in harmonious supplication to deities of thunder and storm. Nobility seemed an unassailable edifice, a towering temple to power where every gesture, every bow and curtsy, bespoke an eternity of unchallenged rule, a world where the divine right of kings was as certain as the rising sun. Yet beneath this glittering, deceptive facade, a profound perversion festered like a hidden wound, suppurating with the poison of unchecked authority, the truth that conquest abroad demanded as its shadowy counterpart, conquest at home. Before the armies marched in disciplined ranks across muddy plains and over treacherous mountains, kings turned inward with a predatory gaze, rehearsing their dominion upon the fragile form of their queens, transforming the warm hearth of the palace into a battlefield of the spirit, where no swords were drawn, but wounds were inflicted all the same, deep, enduring gashes upon the soul that time itself struggled to heal. This internal war was waged in whispers and decrees, in the subtle tightening of restrictions that bound the queen's will as surely as iron shackles bound a prisoner's wrists. It was a perversion so ingrained in the fabric of royal life that it went unquestioned, a ritual as routine as the breaking of bread. Yet its implications rippled outward, tainting the very foundations of the societies these kings purported to protect. The palace, in all its splendor and majesty, became a gilded cage disguised as a sacred temple, its grand halls echoing with the footsteps of courtiers, its gardens blooming with exotic flowers imported from far-flung lands. Yet its rituals were not mere superstition born of ignorance, but deliberate instruments of dominance, encoded meticulously in ancient texts penned by scribes under the flickering light of oil lamps, blessed by high priests who murmured incantations over scrolls yellowed by the passage of centuries and stained with the ink of forgotten scribes. These restrictions were enforced by the unblinking, relentless gaze of fear itself, a fear that permeated every level of the court, like a fog that no wind could dispel. They were no haphazard cruelties inflicted in moments of rage. They were deliberate, calculated acts, a slow, methodical unmaking of the woman's autonomy, ensuring that while the king spilled rivers of blood, foreign fields under skies darkened by smoke and the cries of the dying, his household remained an unblemished altar to his unassailable authority, a pristine sanctuary where doubt had no place to take root. Priests proclaimed these edicts necessary, with fervent conviction, lest the queen's unchecked will summon ill fortune upon the realm. Demons of doubt that slithered from the shadows, or whispers of betrayal carried on the wind that could unravel the carefully woven threads of victory, turning the triumph into tragedy. Guards, sworn to secrecy under oaths that bound them tighter than blood ties, patrolled the labyrinthine corridors of the palace, their heavy footsteps a constant ominous drumbeat of surveillance that echoed through the night, a reminder that no corner was truly private, no secret safe from prying eyes. And in this grand theater of control, where actors played their roles under the spotlight of tradition, the queen's body and soul were the first territories claimed and gained, conquered, a grim rehearsal for the nations and peoples that would follow in the wake of the army's advance. Power, in its most insidious and pervasive form, always begins at home. Listener, ask yourself why the mighty trembled not at the enemy's sharpened sword or the roar of charging cavalry, but at the quiet, unyielding strength of a wife's unspoken gaze, a look that pierced the armor of ego and exposed the fragility beneath. It is in these intimate battles that the true nature of tyranny reveals itself, not in the grand sweeps of history books, but in the stifled sighs of the oppressed. Now let us descend deeper into the heart of this shadowed legacy, dissecting these rituals with the precision of a chronicler's quill upon weathered parchment, unveiling layer by layer the 8 shocking punishments that medieval kings and their ancient forebears from civilizations long buried under sands and soil imposed upon their consorts before venturing into the maelstrom of battle. These were not mere legends spun from the idle tongues of storytellers around campfires, nor fanciful tales embellished for dramatic effect. They were documented edicts, etched indelibly into the annals of history with the solemnity of legal decrees, enforced with clinical ruthlessness across diverse cultures from the cradle of civilization in the Fertile Crescent to the twilight of the Middle Ages in the fractured landscapes of Europe. We shall proceed methodically, each revelation building upon the last like stones in a cathedral of revelation, growing ever darker, more personal, more absurd in their intricacy, until the final one lays bare the profound, existential terror that drove these men, cloaked in the illusion of invincibility, to such extremes of control and cruelty. Feel the weight of this forensic unveiling as if we stand together in the dim, musty archives of forgotten libraries, the air thick with the scent of aged paper and dust motes, dancing in shafts of sunlight, filtering through narrow windows, turning pages stained by the ink of forgotten anguish, and the tears of unnamed scribes who recorded these horrors for posterity. To begin our journey into this abyss, consider the first restriction, rooted deeply in the lore of ancient Mesopotamia, where kings like Hammurabi inscribed their laws on towering stelae that stood as monoliths to justice and order, and echoed faithfully in the courts of early medieval kings such as those of the Carolingian dynasty, whose realm spanned from the Rhine to the Pyrenees under the iron rule of Charlemagne himself. This was the Edict of Isolation, a decree as unyielding as the ziggurats that pierced the Mesopotamian skies. Upon the king's departure, heralded by the blare of trumpets and the thunder of hooves as his retinue rode forth, the queen was confined to her chamber for a full cycle of the moon. Precisely 7 nights and 7 days of unrelenting seclusion, barred from all contact with the outer world, as If the palace walls themselves grew taller and more impenetrable, no maid could enter without the explicit permission of the royal chamberlain, granted only after rigorous scrutiny. No window could be opened to allow even a whisper of breeze from the gardens below or a glimpse of the stars above. She existed in a ritualized void, her only companions the flickering, erratic shadows cast by a single oil lamp on the tapestried walls, shadows that seemed to mock her immobility with their playful dance. This was no mere seclusion intended for quiet prayer or pious reflection. It was a calculated punishment designed to erode her sense of self, to remind her with every passing hour that her freedom, her very identity, was tethered inexorably to his presence, a fragile thread that could snap at his whim. Guards, their faces stern and impassive beneath crested helmets, sealed the heavy oak doors with waxen seals bearing the royal insignia, a roaring lion or a crowned eagle, symbols of unchallenged might, and any breach of this seal, whether by the queen's hand or sympathetic servants, invited not just the king's fury upon his return, but the invocation of divine wrath, with priests calling down curses that promised plague and famine upon the transgressor. Empires across the ages accepted this as essential to the cosmic balance, believing fervently that a queen's wandering eyes, peering out at the world beyond her confines, might invite the gods' disfavor upon the troops marching to war, turning the tide of battle against the realm. In the Carolingian courts, queens like Hildegard, wife of Charlemagne, endured such isolations before his campaigns against the Saxons, their chambers becoming tombs of living isolation, where time stretched into eternity, and the mind wandered into realms of doubt and despair. The psychological toll was immense, a slow unraveling that prepared the ground for the other rituals to follow, ensuring her submission was total before the first clash of arms. As we progress onward, delving into the second punishment, drawn from the rich traditions of ancient Persia, where the Achaemenid kings ruled from the opulent splendor of Persepolis, with its grand Apadana halls and hanging gardens, traditions that were eagerly adopted by the Byzantine emperors in their mosaic-adorned palaces of Constantinople, and later by the Norman kings who conquered England with the ferocity of wolves. We encounter the vow of silence, a decree, the vow of silence, a decree that struck at the very core of human expression. The queen was forbidden, under the most severe penalties, to speak the king's name aloud, or indeed any word that evoked his image or recalled his deeds, lest her utterance carry some mystical power that could distract him from the battlefield or summon misfortune. This prohibition extended far beyond mere names. It encompassed any word that might stir memories of him, turning her vocabulary into a minefield of forbidden syllables. The penalty for violation was harsh. Lashes administered by a trusted executioner in the privacy of the chamber, or even exile to a remote convent where she would spend her days in perpetual prayer and penance, far from the court's intrigues. Her voice, once a powerful tool of counsel in the peacetime assemblies where she advised on matters of state with wisdom honed by years of observation, became a forbidden instrument, silenced by an edict read aloud by a trembling scribe in the presence of the assembly of witnesses, nobles, priests, and guards, who bore testimony to its proclamation. This ritualized muting extended to the subtlest of sounds, whispers shared in solitude, songs hummed under her breath to soothe a restless heart, even sighs of longing or frustration that might escape her lips unbidden, anything that might carry her essence into the ether and potentially disrupt the king's focus amid the chaos of war. In the gilded halls of Constantinople, the formidable Empress Theodora herself, known for her sharp wit and political acumen, endured such a hush before Emperor Justinian's campaigns against the Vandals and Goths, her lips sealed as if her words could summon the specters of defeat from the underworld. The absurdity of this punishment deepened with each passing day. Servants were instructed to communicate with her through an elaborate system of gestures and signs, hand signals developed by court scholars, turning her into a living emblem of utter submission, her silence, a sacred covenant that bound her fragility inexorably to his dominion over life and death. Servants moved like ghosts in her presence, their eyes downcast, conveying messages through nods and points, while the queen's frustration built like a storm. Behind her, sealed lips. Historical chronicles from the Byzantine era describe how this vow was believed to preserve the king's spiritual armor, an invisible shield woven from the threads of her obedience, impervious to the arrows of doubt. In Norman England, Queen Matilda, wife of William the Conqueror, faced similar impositions before his invasions. Her court transformed into a pantomime of silence where even laughter was suspect. The emotional isolation compounded the physical, as days blurred into nights without the comfort of conversation, forcing her to confront the depths of her own thoughts in solitude. This vow was not just a silencing of the voice, but an assault on the soul, a reminder that her words, like her body, belonged to the crown, not to her as an individual. As we reflect on this, listener, consider how such a simple act, denying speech, could unravel the fabric of a person's identity, turning a queen into a mute spectator in her own life. The progression intensifies as we arrive at the third punishment, the ritual of fasting, observed with fervent devotion in the sun-scorched courts of ancient Egypt, where pharaohs like Ramses II built temples that dwarfed the pyramids and ruled as living gods along the life-giving Nile, and later revived in the medieval Islamic caliphates of the Abbasid dynasty, whose influence seeped into European monarchs through trade routes and scholarly exchanges, blending Eastern mysticism with Western chivalry. Here, the personal invasion of the queen's autonomy escalates from the mental to the physical, compelling her to abstain from all sustenance, save for sips of water drawn from sacred wells consecrated by priests in elaborate ceremonies, for a grueling 3 days preceding the king's march to war. Her body, once nourished by the finest delicacies of the royal kitchens, roasted meats spiced with saffron, fruits from orchards tended by slaves, breads baked in ovens fueled by sacred woods, was now weakened and hollowed out, a vessel of enforced deprivation that mirrored, in perverse symmetry, the king's own ascetic preparation for battle, where he might fast to sharpen his senses and purify his intent. This ritual was framed by the religious elite as a profound act of purification, a defilement of her own vitality offered up as a sacrificial gift to the gods of war. Yet beneath this pious veneer lay a darker purpose, punishment for her very existence as a potential source of temptation, a woman whose appetites might symbolize the softness that could undermine the hardness required for conquest. Daily inspections were mandated, conducted by priestesses in flowing linen robes or eunuchs whose neutrality was deemed essential. Their hands, probing gently but insistently for signs of hidden indulgence, crumbs on her garments, the scent of forbidden food on her breath, or the subtle plumpness that might betray cheating. In the reign of Charlemagne, the great Frankish emperor whose conquests reshaped Europe, his queens reportedly fasted in this manner before his brutal Saxon wars, their emaciated forms paraded subtly before the court as testaments to the perversion of devotion into outright torment. Their hollow cheeks and outright torment, shadowed eyes a visual sermon on submission. Entire societies nodded in somber approval, whispering among themselves in the shadowed alcoves of the palace that a well-fed queen might breed complacency in the ranks of soldiers. Her sated state a harbinger of laziness that could doom the army to defeat. Thus her hunger became a sacrificial offering to victory's altar, her weakened body a proxy for the blood that would soon be spilled. Egyptian papyri from the New Kingdom describe similar fasts imposed on queens like Nefertari before pharaonic campaigns, where the Nile's floods were invoked as metaphors for the renewal that her abstinence promised. In Islamic caliphates such as under Harun al-Rashid, queens fasted in ornate harems, their deprivation monitored by viziers who recorded every detail in ornate ledgers. The physical toll was devastating: dizziness, fainting spells, a gnawing ache that echoed the emotional void, yet it was endured as a badge of loyalty, though in truth, it stripped her of strength, rendering her even more dependent upon the king's return. This ritual blurred the line between piety and cruelty, showing how power could sanctify suffering, turning the body's basic needs into weapons of control. As we Contemplate this, listener. Ask, how does denying bread to the hand that rocks the cradle fortify the sword that wields the scepter? Deeper still into the labyrinth of these impositions we venture with the fourth punishment, the bodily inspection. A practice that harkens back to the disciplined world of the Roman Empire, where emperors like Augustus and Trajan maintained their vast domains through a bureaucracy of ritual and law, practices that permeated the courts of medieval Europe under the Holy Roman emperors whose coronations in Aachen echoed the grandeur of Rome. Before the clarion call to battle, the queen underwent a ritual examination by male priests, clad in vestments embroidered with sacred symbols, or trusted advisors sworn to secrecy, her garments removed slowly in a chamber lit only by the tremulous flame of a single beeswax candle, its light casting eerie patterns on the walls, like the omens it sought to divine. The purpose was to confirm her purity, free from any marks of infidelity, such as bruises from secret lovers, or impurities like blemishes that might be interpreted as curses from jealous gods, all of which could allegedly taint the army's fortunes and invite defeat. This clinical violation, documented in exhaustive detail in the edicts of emperors like Frederick Barbarossa, who led the Third Crusade with a zeal that bordered on fanaticism, stripped her of all dignity in an instant, reducing her once regal form to a mere object under the cold scrutiny of institutional eyes, her skin mapped meticulously like a battlefield scouted for weaknesses, every curve and contour probed for flaws that might symbolize broader disloyalty. Guards waited just outside the chamber door, their armored forms a silent threat ready to enforce compliance if she dared resist, their spears glinting in the hallway torchlight, while the inspectors intoned ancient prayers over her exposed form, invoking deities of fidelity and protection. The moral weight of this act is crushing, a profound perversion, while the king prepared to wage war and embrace impurity in the rivers of blood that would flow on distant fields, sowing death and chaos without remorse. His wife's body must remain an untouched, pristine sanctuary, her exposure a shocking, intimate reminder of dominion's reach into the most private sanctums of existence, where even the sanctity of the flesh was forfeit to the state's demands. Roman legal texts, such as those compiled in the Corpus Juris Civilis under Justinian, allude to similar inspections for imperial consorts, ensuring their chastity before military endeavors. In the Holy Roman Empire, Barbarossa's decree specified that such examinations be conducted by holy men of the cloth, with results recorded in sealed parchments. The queen's humiliation was compounded by the presence of witnesses in some cases, nobles who averted their eyes but whose knowledge spread like wildfire through the court gossip. Physical discomfort, the chill of the air on bare skin, the invasive touch of strangers, paled beside the psychological scar, a violation that echoed long after the inspectors departed. Societies rationalized it as necessary for cosmic harmony, believing an impure queen could summon plagues upon the troops, yet it revealed the king's projection of his battlefield insecurities onto her body. Eleanor of Aquitaine, though not directly documented in this exact form, faced analogous scrutinies under her husband's rules, her legendary beauty, both a crown and a curse. This punishment marks a turning point, where control transcends the external to invade the corporeal, a harbinger of the even more invasive rituals to come. Reflect, listener, on the shudder-bullying irony. In preparing for war's brutality, they inflicted a brutality all their own upon the innocent. As the shadows lengthen in our exploration, we reach the fifth restriction, the vigil of surveillance, a practice that prevailed in the feudal kingdoms of France and England during the protracted agony of the 100 Years' War, a conflict that scarred the landscapes from the fields of Crécy to the walls of Orléans, where kings like Philip VI and Edward III wielded power with a paranoia born of endless skirmishes. The queen was placed under constant, unrelenting watch by a cadre of armed guards, their numbers rotating in shifts to ensure no lapse in vigilance, her every movement chronicled with bureaucratic precision in thick ledgers bound in leather and inscribed with quills dipped in iron gall ink, whom she saw in fleeting glimpses through barred windows. What object she touched in her chamber, be it a book of poetry or a jeweled comb, even the direction of her gaze, whether toward the door in hope or the ceiling in resignation. No visitors were permitted without the king's pre-approved writ, no letters dispatched or received. Her isolation was total and absolute, enforced by physical chains bolted to the door if her restlessness was deemed a threat, the metal links clinking like a dirge in the quiet nights. King Edward III, the warrior monarch whose longbowmen turned the tide at Poitiers, imposed this vigilant oversight on his devoted Queen Philippa before his soy. Campaigns in France, transforming her opulent chambers into a veritable prison of paranoia, where even a casual glance at a map of the realm, spread on a table, might be interpreted as treasonous plotting or sorcery. This apparatus of oversight grew absurdly intimate and invasive over time. Maids, under oath of loyalty, were required to report her dreams recounted in sleep talk, whispered conversations with herself, in moments of solitude, punishable by immediate flogging with a leather strap, and even the rhythm of her breathing monitored for signs of distress that might indicate hidden rebellion. Societies upheld this as a sacred safeguard against the dark arts of sorcery or espionage, with priests blessing the ledgers as holy records. Yet, it laid bare the king's deepest fear, not the hail of arrows from French longbows or the charge of knights in plate armor, but the unpredictable wandering of a woman's mind beyond the strict confines of his control, a mind that might harbor thoughts of independence or alliance with rivals. Chronicles from the era, such as those by Jean Froissart, describe how Queen Philippa's surveillance extended to her meals, with guards tasting food for poison while noting her appetite and her attire, inspected for hidden messages sewn into hymns. The constant presence of eyes, dozens of them, shifting but ever present, created a panopticon of the soul, where privacy evaporated like morning dew. Punishments for perceived infractions ranged from solitary confinement in a windowless cell to public shaming, where the queen might be paraded before the court in simple rags. This vigil not only isolated but infantilized her, reducing a ruler's consort to a child under watch, her agency dissolved in the ink of reports sent to the king on the front lines. In French courts, similar measures were applied to queens like Isabeau of Bavaria during Charles VI's mad reign, her every step shadowed by spies amid the war's chaos. The absurdity peaked in details like recording the queen's yawns or stretches, deeming them potential signals. Thus, surveillance became a weapon sharper than any blade, cutting into the fabric of trust and autonomy. Ponder this escalation, listener. When does watchfulness become warfare? The sixth punishment, the prohibition of tears, emerged from the mist-shrouded traditions of Celtic-influenced medieval Scotland and Ireland, lands where ancient Druidic rites blended with Christian fervor, and kings like Robert the Bruce, the heroic figure who reclaimed Scottish independence at Bannockburn, ritualized emotional restraint as a cornerstone of martial preparation. The queen was banned outright from weeping or displaying any overt sign of grief as her husband departed for the fray, lest her sorrow, seen as a potent emotional force, summon tempests upon the seas or weaken the warrior's resolve with echoes of domestic fragility carried on the wind. Enforced with hawk-like intensity by a select group of attendants, often female relatives or loyal ladies-in-waiting trained in observation, any tear shed, any quiver of the lip or sob suppressed, invited swift and severe punishment, perhaps immediate confinement, in a darkened, airless cell deep within the castle dungeons, its walls dripping with moisture and echoing with the distant roar of waves, or public shaming before the assembled court, where she would be forced to kneel in penance while nobles whispered judgments. This edict, meticulously recorded in the chronicles of the Bruce era, such as the vivid accounts in John Barber's The Bruce, turned her natural human fragility into a heinous crime, her emotions dammed up like a raging river behind the unyielding stone of royal command, threatening to burst forth with catastrophic consequences. The perversion lay in its profound absurdity. While battlefields would soon drown in rivers of blood, the cries of the wounded mingling with the clash of steel under leaden skies, the queen's quiet, Personal lament was deemed the greater defilement, a pollutant that could seep into the army's morale like poison in a well her unmaking, a forced stoicism that bordered on emotional amputation, a grim prelude to the physical unmaking of foes. On the field, in Scottish courts, queens like Elizabeth de Burgh, Bruce's wife, endured this before his guerrilla campaigns against the English, her face a mask of composure as trumpets blared, though chronicles hint at the inner turmoil that gnawed at her spirit. Attendants patrolled with cloths at the ready to dab away any errant moisture, and punishments included wearing a skull's bridle, an iron muzzle designed for gossips but repurposed here, or reciting oaths of joy in the face of joy in the face of departure. Celtic lore underpinned this, with tales of banshees whose wails foretold doom, making the Queen's tears a potential harbinger. In Ireland, under kings like those of the O'Neill dynasty, similar prohibitions were tied to weather omens, tears believed to call forth rains that bogged down armies. The emotional suppression led to internalized suffering, nightmares, physical ailments from bottled grief, yet was glorified as strength, a queen's noble bearing praised in ballads. This ritual exposed the fragility of power. Kings, armored against men, feared the soft power of a woman's emotion. As we near the end, listener, feel the growing darkness. How tears, the essence of empathy, became taboo in realms built on conquest. The seventh punishment, the solitary slumber, was a staple in the rugged Germanic courts of the Holy Roman Empire, where emperors like Otto the Great forged their domains through alliances and iron will, and later adopted by the ambitious English Plantagenet kings, whose reigns were marked by intrigue from the Angevin Empire to the Wars of the Roses. The Queen was forced to sleep alone in a vast, echoing bedchamber, its four-poster bed a monolithic structure draped in heavy brocades and furs. Its linens inspected each dawn by royal chamberlains, stern officials in tabards bearing the imperial eagle, who scoured for evidence of nocturnal visitors, such as disturbed pillows or foreign scents, or even acts of self-comfort deemed polluting to the king's spiritual armor, impurities that could weaken his resolve like rust on a blade. King Henry II, the formidable ruler whose clashes with the church and barons defined his era, reportedly decreed this for the indomitable Eleanor of Aquitaine. Before his expeditions to Ireland and Wales, though she, with her Aquitanian fire, chafed visibly under its oppressive weight, her nights transformed into a ritual of enforced celibacy and profound vulnerability that left her exposed to the chill, drafts and the ghosts of solitude. Guards patrolled the antechambers with lanterns casting long shadows, their vigilance unbroken through the witching hours, and in some courts, the bed's sturdy posts were bound with iron chains or engraved with iron and chains, runes symbolizing fidelity, a tangible reminder of her bondage even in repose. This intimate absurdity escalated the darkness to new depths. Her body, once shared in the sacred covenant of marriage, a union blessed by church and state, became a forbidden territory patrolled by suspicion. Her solitude a deliberate punishment that echoed and amplified the king's physical absence, breeding a dread that festered in the quiet, starless hours when fears multiplied unchecked. Plantagenet records, such as those in the pipe rolls, detail inspections involving scented hounds to detect intruders, while Eleanor's biographers note her correspondence hinting at the loneliness that fueled her later rebellions. In the Holy Roman Empire, empresses like Theophanu faced similar decrees before Otto II's Italian campaigns, their sleep monitored by eunuchs or confessors who listened at keyholes. The ritual extended to pre-bedtime routines, no warming stones in the bed, no shared furs and dreams, reported upon waking as potential omens. Punishments for infractions included sleep deprivation or public vows of chastity renewed before the court. This slumber ordinance not only isolated but desecrated intimacy, turning rest, a universal need, into a site of control. Societies viewed it as preserving the king's vital essence, believing shared beds diluted martial vigor, yet it underscored the paranoia of rulers who saw betrayal in every shadow. Eleanor's endurance, whispered in troubadour songs, highlights the human cost, a queen's spirit dimmed by enforced widowhood in life. Now, listener, brace for the culmination. And now the eighth, the most shocking, the one that will haunt your thoughts long after these words fade into the ether, lingering like a specter in the recesses of your mind, the oath of immobility. In the sun-drenched yet intrigue-filled annals of medieval Spain, under the wise yet authoritarian Alfonso X, El Sabio, whose legal reforms in the Cit Partidas codified royal customs and echoed hauntingly in the rituals of the Crusader kings who marched to the Holy Land with crosses emblazoned on their tunics, the queen was commanded to remain utterly still, as if carved from unyielding marble by the hand of a divine sculptor, for the entire duration of the campaign. Days bleeding into weeks of enforced paralysis, confined to her throne in the great hall, or the rigid frame of her bed, her muscles aching from disuse. She could not rise to stretch her limbs, could not gesture with her hands in supplication or command, could not even shift her gaze from a fixed point designated by the decree. Attendants, trained in this macabre art, fed her by spoon with measured portions of broth and bread, while royal portions of broth and braille, royal. Physicians monitored her pulse and breathing with cold instruments, ensuring compliance under the dire threat of excommunication from the church, or, in extreme cases, death by the king's justice upon return for those who aided violation. This ultimate ritualized imprisonment, documented exhaustively in the Cit Partidas legal code, a monumental work of 7 parts outlining everything from feudal rights to marital duties, stemmed from a profound, visceral terror that gripped the hearts of these rulers, not the enemy's vast hordes thundering across plains with scimitars raised, nor the siege engines hurling stones at castle walls, but the quiet, insidious autonomy of their wives. The spark of independent will that might ignite rebellion. In the king's absence, a flame that could spread from the palace to the peasantry. It was the emotional climax of control's perversion, turning a living, breathing woman into a lifeless monument of silence and stasis, her unmaking complete and utter, her existence erased from the flow of time to preserve his fragile illusion of omnipotence, a god-king whose power extended even over emotion itself. In Spain, queens like Violent of Aragon endured this before Alfonso's Reconquista pushes, describing their statue-like poses as offerings to Santiago, the patron saint of war. Crusader kings, such as those in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, imposed it on consorts like Melisande, believing motion equated to chaos, stillness to divine order. Attendants whispered prayers to maintain the pose, using slings or supports if needed, while violations, a twitch or blink, led to penance like flagellation. The physical agony, cramping, bed sores, loss of circulation, mirrored the mental torment of objectification, reducing her to a symbol rather than a person. Society sanctified it as apotropaic, warding off evil through inertia, yet it exposed the king's deepest insecurity, women's agency, as the true threat to patriarchy. How devastating, listener, to realize that the mightiest rulers, who commanded legions and toppled thrones, quake before the quiet power of a woman's unbound spirit, forging chains from the raw material of fear itself, chains that bound not just bodies, but the very essence of freedom. What kind of civilization, then, commences its wars by erecting such elaborate, gilded cages around its women, silencing their voices with vows that echo into eternity, starving their bodies until weakness becomes worship, inspecting their souls with hands that profane the sacred, placing them under vigils that pierce the veil of privacy, prohibiting their tears as if emotion were enemy, enforcing slumbers that isolate the heart, and culminating in immobilities that isolate the heart, petrify the will? This hidden history, unearthed from dusty tomes and whispered legends, whispers a timeless, chilling warning. Power, in its relentless quest for dominion over the world, twists sacred rituals into insidious instruments of oppression, ensnaring the most defenseless, the queens who birthed empires, in webs of fear, fragility, and fabricated necessity. Control does not conquer distant lands or vanquish foreign foes first. It begins in the warm, intimate hearth of the home, perverting the holy covenant of marriage into cold captivity, devotion into deliberate defilement, and love into a tool of subjugation. Empires may crumble to dust, their palaces overrun by vines and forgotten by time, their kings reduced to footnotes in history's vast ledger, but the echo of these edicts lingers on like a persistent shadow, a cautionary tale against the unmaking of humanity under the guise of martial necessity or divine mandate. It reminds us that true conquest is not measured in miles of territory gained, but in the spirits broken at its outset. If this story has unsettled the foundations of your understanding, if it has reminded you how easily devotion can morph into domination, how piety can cloak cruelty, and how history's heroes often stood on pedestals built from the suffering of the unseen, then share it far and wide. Because history only redeems what it remembers, illuminating the dark corners where truths were buried. Only by uncovering these rituals, by giving voice to the silenced and agency to the immobilized, can we strip history of its disguises and finally hear the voices that power tried so desperately to erase, their echoes rising like a chorus against the tide of tyranny.